title of my presentation is African Resistance to the Encroachment of European Colonial Rule. Ladies and gentlemen, before I go to the gist of what I want to present, two things. One, I just want to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this extremely important partnership that is actually bringing Africa and America together. It is a program that recreates the thinking that we ideally need to have about the African continent and the African peoples, wherever they are in the planet. And therefore, I would like to thank Tony Kenneth and Dr. Pamela Hall, who have actually put this together and coordinated the program in such a way that have put forth a very important subject to discuss that touches on Al-Kebulani, shining the light on the dark continent. And I'm sure you know by now that the name by which we go by as Africans and the name of our continent is actually foreign to us. The original name of the continent is Al-Kebulani. So this program has become very handy in creating fairly a new understanding about the most misunderstood continent. Secondly, I'm not lost of the fact that I'm making this presentation online from my nation's capital here in Nairobi, Kenya, in Africa. And the significance of this is that one, of course, is historical and the other is geographical. One is that generally Africa is regarded as the cradle of humanity. The home of all of us is here. And archaeological evidence point to the fact that Eastern Africa is most likely the home of the first human beings. Nairobi and Kenya are in Eastern Africa. And I could simply presume that there is a sense in which we are all East Africans. And therefore, there is no better place where one will make such a presentation from than from Eastern Africa. Second, Kenya and Nairobi is the land of Mau Mau. Mau Mau was actually the hallmark of African resistance to colonial rule in the African continent that took place here in Nairobi and Kenya generally in the 1950s, and eventually saw the British pack up and leave the country. There's no better place to speak about African resistance to colonialism than from Nairobi then. And finally, of course, there is a sense in which geographically Kenya is the heart of Africa. If you turn round away from the map of Africa and you give it your back and you put your hand where your heart is, you realize that in the map of Africa, Kenya will be where your hand is on your heart. That way, we regard it as the heart of Africa. African resistance to the encroachment of European rule. For centuries, Africa has been viewed, and unfortunately so, through socially constructed but warped and wrong notions. Notions of artificially constructed Negroness of Africans and African Americans. This is a continent seen as a dark entity, a benighted region in which nothing works, a land of ignoble people and insurmountable savagery, strange diseases, hunger and violence, a continent always available for international charity and help. With this maligning and dehumanizing portrait of Africa, it was very easy for the architects of colonialism to justify it through the rhetoric of the so-called 3 C's: civilizing, Christianizing, and the establishment of legitimate commerce. Far from it. Colonialism was unwelcome in Africa generally, even in areas in which it was imposed using the Maxim gun. It was still unwelcome. Even in areas in which people had been worn down by environmental vagaries and they needed help, colonialism was still unwelcome. This lecture is a very brief highlight of African resistance to colonial encroachment, particularly in the last years of the 19th century and early 20th century. The key goal of this presentation is to disabuse the notion of the overly biased and usually over Eurocentric notions that Africa was all ready to lose its identity, to lose its sovereignty, to lose its power for the sake of progress and the end of civil unrest and the purported dictatorships that dominated Africa before colonialism. And I want to suggest in this brief presentation that resistance to colonial encroachment by all means was actually the clarion call of many Africans at the dawn of the colonial period in the continent. Let me illustrate these using some story from African folklore. There's a story about the encounter between a rabbit, a small but gracious and fluffy animal, and a lion, the king of the African savanna grasslands. One day, the story goes, the marauding lion wasn't successful in its hunting escapades. After looking for animals to kill for a whole day, it encountered a small rabbit on its way. Hastily, like hungry lions do, it got hold of it and was ready to turn it into a quick meal. However, the poor and shaky rabbit pleaded with the lion, "Please, spare me for just a moment and put me down on the ground. After that, you can take me up, get hold of me, and have a very nice lunch." The big, hungry lion obliged. After all, a rabbit is a small animal, and catching it again won't be a problem if it tries any silly business of running away. Once the rabbit was down, it vigorously started scratching the ground. And after some minutes, A ball of dust went up the air at the amusement of the mighty lion. Out of curiosity, the king of the jungle inquired from the rabbit why this was necessary. In a calm but sharp voice, the rabbit said, "I want whoever will come here and find parts of my dead body after your lunch to know that I did not just die, but I died fighting, that I resisted vigorously, that I was not just eaten, I fought back." Friends, what I will say in this lecture to you, brothers and sisters, is that Africans did not surrender their countries, their communities, their homes, or their families to colonialism. They did not hand over their birthrights to the encroaching European imperial powers in the dawn of the 20th century. They did not welcome what could become the African Holocaust. I want to let you know that those who died as they fought back. Others kicked their enemies even as they breathed their last. And still others scratched and died in a bowl of dust in the battlegrounds, just like the poor rabbit. By the 1880s, that's towards the end of the 19th century, the effects of the Industrial Revolution in Europe had set the stage for an ambitious imperial foreign policy for European states, from Britain to France, from Germany to Belgium, from Italy, name it. The Industrial Revolution had changed the way of life and the ambitions of the nation states of Europe. This tremendous change coincided with the popular images of the empty African continent, which badly needed occupation. The 19th century travelers, imperial poets, and Christian missionaries depicted Africa as the white man's burden, which was ready and available for help. Many missionaries who came to the African continent in the name of helping the Africans from heathenism, from the worshipping of mountains and trees and animals, went back to their respective countries and gave an image of a people who were at the verge of extinction. One classic example I remember is the legendary Dr. David Livingstone, the British missionary who worked in East and Central Africa. In the early 1860s, he was giving a lecture to Cambridge undergraduates. And in the lecture, he said, and I quote, "Sons of the noble race, I beseech you to go yonder to Africa and help the Negro from extinction." The British imperial poet Rudyard Kipling was even more bold in describing Africans as new-caught sullen peoples, half devil, half child. Even in very recent years, some European scholars denied the existence of African history before colonialism. Classic example is the celebrated professor of history, Professor Tropper Roper of Oxford, who in the late 50s, early 60s, in one of his publications, he said, and I quote, that perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach. What is there now is a history of European administrators, European missionaries, and European explorers. The rest is darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history. Friends, the interjection of this imperial misinformation and the outward-looking imperial policy of Europeans culminated in the Berlin Conference of 1885. The Berlin Conference started in December 1884 and crossed over to January 1885, in which Africa was actually shared among European countries as if it was a melony. Various powers established their spheres of influence over Africa, and from the 1880s laid down procedures for the establishment of their colonial territories in Africa. As a result of this, as a result of these events taking place in faraway Europe, they led to the emergence of colonialism in the continent of Africa. In its early years, colonialism was manifested in the complex duality of fundamental change and challenge, the twin characteristics which defined the African response to it. Colonialism fundamentally changed the relationship between Europeans and Africans. In the colonies in which Europeans moved in and settled, I think of my own country, Kenya. I think of a country in Central Africa, Zimbabwe. I think of South Africa. In such countries, the African traditional economic system was replaced by the politically instigated wage economy brought in by the colonial, mainly agrarian economy through racist colonial capital. Essentially, for it to thrive, the colonial economy invested in a binary of forces of organization and forces of disorganization, forces of empowerment and those of disempowerment. While colonial capital organized and empowered the European settlers into a formidable economic force, occupying the most of the fertile lands in many countries across Africa, it disorganized and disempowered Africans in ways that turned them into hostages of colonial benevolence as either squatters in European farms or peasant dwellers of and in areas reserved for Africans. For example, in Kenya here, we had the so-called African reserves. In South Africa, we had the Bantustans, where Africans were confined to. Politically, colonialism was a challenge to African sovereignty and independence of the various autonomous political entities that existed in the continent before colonialism. And therefore, the earliest and initial establishment of colonial control in Africa was met locally by the binary of the forces of resistance and those of collaboration, war and diplomacy, confrontation and some kind of persuasion. For the resistors of the encroaching colonial state, ranging from King Prembe I of Ashanti in Ghana, King Wabogo of Mosi in modern-day Burkina Faso, King Majembe of the Yao people in modern-day Tanzania, King Lubengula of the Ndebele in modern-day Zimbabwe, to King Setswayo of the Zulu in South Africa. Colonialism was an opportunity to stand up against the invasive compromise of communal security and the independence of local institutions, as well as security structures of autonomy by an uninvited foreigner. For those who pursued diplomacy, the collaborators, for those who sought to solve the challenges that colonialism presented diplomatically, the phenomena, the specter that colonialism was, presented an expedient opportunity for survival in an increasingly hostile economic and political environment. For example, the Maasai of Kenya and the Baganda of Uganda, who pursued a foreign policy of collaboration nascent in the beginning colonial period, had been bedeviled and weakened by political succession, for example, in the case of the Maasai, and disputes within their community, and the enduring effects of human and animal diseases, particularly smallpox and rinderpest epidemics. Largely, therefore, colonialism, to those who pursued diplomacy, held the twin promise of relief and revival. However, they will soon realize, and painfully so, that colonialism, wherever you found it, it meant one and the same thing. It meant one and the same thing. It meant, one, alienation of the local people, not just from their cultural setting, but also from familiar economic practices and political institutions. Alienated people become very easy to dominate, and dominated people become very easy to control. And that was the essence of colonialism: alienation, domination, and control. Whether you confronted them through military war, or you pursued them diplomatically to find an amicable solution to retain your power and sovereignty as an African community, you still went through what was the essence of colonialism: alienating Africans from their roots in order to make it easy to dominate them and then control them. By the beginning of the First World War in 1914, many African regions had surrendered to the colonial powers. Many of those who militarily confronted the colonialists met the fire of the Maxim gun, which was a direct product of the technological and industrial advancement that came with the Industrial Revolution. A number of African leaders, like King Lubengula of the Ndebele of Zimbabwe, King Setswayo of the Zulu of South Africa, were exiled from their homelands. Others, such as Chivueyaki Wainga of the Kikuyu in Kenya, and the leader of the Nandi, both in Kenya, were assassinated. The English poet Belloc, H. Belloc, captured this situation when he said, and I quote, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not." Many of the Africans who resisted colonialism suffered on the hands of the colonialists. Many of their leaders were killed and assassinated in different ways. While many communities and countries were brought under colonial rule by the colonial conquest and separation state, only 2 countries stood independent and sovereign: Liberia and Ethiopia. Liberia, because it was already an outpost of freed slaves from America who were brought back home. Ethiopia, because they resisted and resisted successfully the Italian invasion and the Italian attempts to make the country of Ethiopia part of their Eastern Africa colonial empire. The story of Ethiopia and their encounter with Imperial Italy is a very interesting story, particularly in the Battle of Adwa, which was fought between the Ethiopian forces of Emperor Menelik and the Italian armies who were threatening to bring this great country of Africa under Italy's northeastern African colonial empire. And it's very interesting when you quote the description of this war between the Ethiopians and the Italians. And I would like to quote a fairly long quotation from an American historian, Harold Marcus, in his book, A History of Ethiopia, published by University of California Press, 2002, in Berkeley, and the pages 98 to 100. And this is what Marcus says, and I'm quoting. The general commander of the Italian military, General Oreste Baratieri, and his army of 8,463 Italians and 10,749 local Africans held high ground in the Ethiopian mountains. General Baratieri was prepared to outwit his enemy, whose limited supplies could have forced retirement southwards, permitting Baratieri to claim victory and also advance deeper into Ethiopian territory. At about 9 p.m. on February 28, 1896, Italians began a forced march to the 3 hills that dominated the Ethiopian camp to surprise and challenge King Menelik's army. To secure his left, Baratieri sent his reserve brigade to an unnamed nearby 4th E hill. But the Ethiopian local guide, either through misdirection or sabotage, led the Italians astray. Not only was the left flank uncovered, but also a quarter of the Italian forces were rendered useless and vulnerable. So even if Baratieri's army had occupied the high points and deployed in strong defensive positions on the frontal slopes, it was foredoomed to defeat. Indeed, the timing of the Italian attack as a surprise on the early Sunday morning was all wrong. At 5:30 a.m. in the morning of 29th February 1896, King Menelik's 100,000-man army moved forward to confront an Italian force of 14,500 soldiers. By 9 a.m. in the morning, the outcome was obvious. The Italian center had crumbled, and other units were in danger of being flanked by Ethiopians who had found the gap in Pariteri's defenses. By noon, when retreat sounded, the Italians had paid dearly. 4,000 Europeans and 2,000 locals had died. 1,428 of Pariteri's soldiers had been wounded, and 1,800 prisoners were held by the mighty Ethiopians. All told, the Italian army lost 70% of its forces, a disaster for even a modern army. In sharp contrast, Menerik's forces suffered an estimated 4,000 to 7,000 people killed, and perhaps as many as 10,000 wounded, which made for acceptably low ratio if you compare with his 100,000 strong man army. The Italian enemy had been destroyed, whereas the Ethiopian army remained in being, strengthened by the weapons and material abandoned in the field. The victory was unequivocally Ethiopian. Quote closes. Friends, I will conclude this just like Marcus concludes his narrative, that Menerik's victory at the Battle of Adwa did guarantee Ethiopia another generation and a one half of virtually unchallenged independence. It gave the country a status similar to that of Afghanistan, Persia, Japan, and Thailand as accepted anomalies in the imperialist world order. Quote closes. Ethiopians remained independent in the midst of imperial powers because they paid by blood for their freedom. In conclusion of my presentation, let me say this. One of the most successful goals of this project is the reconnection. The reconnection of African Americans with Africa and vice versa to discuss about the continent's initiatives of resistance to colonialism, resistance to oppressors, and a bid to liberate ourselves. Friends, this is what defines our identity here in Africa, as it does that of you in America and wherever you find Africans in the diaspora. Whether it was the resistance of captured slaves in their harrowing journey across the Atlantic, the African role in the struggles for the initial independence of America, or the African role in the reparation wars in Africa. As the UNESCO, as the General History of Africa by UNESCO says, we have always stood up to fight for our destiny. We have always stood up to fight for our place. We have always stood up to fight for our relevance. It is these struggles which have left an indelible imprint of Africans and Africanness in many places around the world. From Haiti to Brazil, the Caribbean to America, it is the struggle for justice, the struggle for fairness, the struggle for freedom and identity which defines us Africans. This is what connects us and provides us with similarities as one people, one race, the Negroid race. Thank you.